Hi, and welcome to Chapter a Day. We're on Mark chapter 8 today. This is the 8th in our series looking at a chapter a day from the Gospel of Mark. If you've been following us over each part of the series, you've seen the various themes that are coming out. We always reiterate that the first theme, the first concept or idea that Mark presents to us is in the very opening of this Gospel, where he says that the Gospel is the good news of Jesus, the Son of God. Recognizing that he was writing to a mainly Jewish audience, many of whom who have likely heard or may even have witnessed many of the events around Jesus' life, his death and his resurrection, but now need to grapple with the question, who is Jesus and what then does it mean for them? We've been looking at Jesus' work, his miracles, his interaction with his disciples. One of the things we've seen is, of course, the hardening of hearts. Those who experience Jesus but do not yet understand who he is. We see how when people are faced with the question, how does Jesus do what he does? The answer to that question either leads people toward faith or to offense. So here we're in chapter 8, and we have the account of the feeding of the 4,000. Now, as you recall, back in chapter 6, we had the story of the feeding of the 5,000. So now Mark is giving us the other account of where Jesus feeds a large multitude. In those days, when again a great crowd had gathered, and they had nothing to eat, he called his disciples to him and said to them, I have compassion on the crowd, because they have been with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat. And if I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on the way. And some of them have come from far away. So Jesus is setting up the disciples for a teachable moment, while at the same time providing for this group of people. So he tells the disciples, of course, that there is this large group with him. Again, as we mentioned before, we're given a number in this gospel of about 4,000. That is likely the men who were present. And so it would be 4,000 men plus women and children who are with them. Even if this is the exact number of 4,000 men, women, and children, it's still a phenomenal amount. Jesus gives us some information. He tells us that this group has been with him for 3 days. In all likelihood, what that means is that they have been joining him, coming. People probably came seeking him out. Some of them may have brought food resources with them, but they've been with him now so long as he's been teaching them. And the hunger that they have for what he is offering them in his teaching has been such that they didn't want to leave. But now they've reached the point where they need physical sustenance as well. So Jesus is presenting the situation of these people need to be fed. Now, we, reading through this gospel, know that it was not that long before, in the flow of the narrative, that we were in a similar situation of which Jesus had this great multitude of 5,000 plus people. Jesus posed it to the disciples. The disciples didn't know what to do. And Jesus demonstrated his divine power in meeting the physical needs of these people overabundantly. So our first assumption is, okay, this is a similar story. The disciples have grown in their understanding of who Jesus is, of how Jesus does what he does. Therefore, they are going to be ready this time to demonstrate faith. So we read the account. Verse 4, and his disciples answered him, how can one feed these people with bread here in this desolate place? So Jesus poses the need, and the disciples' response is, it can't be done. Here's the need, it can't be done. What does this immediately demonstrate about the disciples? What it is showing is that the disciples still do not understand who Jesus is. Even though they have witnessed his divine power in numerous situations, even though they've seen the exact same situation, how Jesus provided miraculously, when given the same situation again, they immediately go back to regular flesh thinking. Here we are in a desolate place, there's no food around, how can we feed these people? So Jesus asked them, how many loaves do you have? And they said, 7. And he directed the crowd to sit down on the ground. And he took the 7 loaves, and having given thanks, he broke them and gave them to his disciples to set before the people. And they set them before the crowd. And they had a few small fish, and having blessed them, he said that those should also be set before them. Now notice in verse 8, and they ate and were satisfied. And they took up the broken pieces left over, 7 baskets full. And there were about 4,000 people. And he sent them away. So what do we see? We see again Jesus demonstrating his divine power meets their needs. They all were satisfied. Not only were they satisfied, but again, there was overabundance. So once again, though the disciples don't believe that Jesus is able, Jesus demonstrates his power. He demonstrates this both to the multitude, but also to his disciples. So the question that we have to ask ourselves is, okay, so now the disciples get it. But we have to understand that we're dealing with a spiritual matter. All of this is not simply cognitive in what we think. We're dealing with a spiritual matter. It takes spiritual eyes to see what is really happening. For the disciples, to see one miracle is an amazing thing, but until they spiritually understand who Jesus is, that event stands in isolation. It doesn't compute that Jesus is always going to be able. So their reaction is very human. But it demonstrates that they're not getting it. And the reason they're not getting it is because of the hardening of the heart. Which is the human condition. The human condition outside of the work of the Holy Spirit in the life of a person is a hard heart. So for these disciples, it's not that they're ignorant, that they're blind. It's just if you cannot grasp yet who Jesus is, you can't assume in faith what he will do. We see this theme of the hard heart continued in the next passage. The Pharisees came and began to argue with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven to test him. And he sighed deeply in his spirit and said, why does this generation seek a sign? Truly I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation. And he left them, got into the boat again, and went to the other side. So here we have this picture. We have the Pharisees. And the Pharisees come to Jesus. And they're saying, look, we will believe in you if you give us you do something that demonstrates to us that you are from God, and we will accept you, we will embrace you, we will believe in you. Now, when you look at this, in the context of what has been happening. How many examples of divine power have we witnessed going through this part of this short gospel? We've seen Jesus feed 5,000 plus people. We've seen Jesus feed 4,000 plus people. We've seen Jesus heal everyone who came to him in villages and towns and communities. We've seen him command power over evil spirits so that those evil spirits could not resist him. We've seen him teach with authority. All this is known, and the Pharisees say, oh, well, if you just gave us a sign, then we'd believe you. And we see Jesus' response. It says he groaned in his spirit. The hardness of the heart, which is a result of sin, grieves him. Jesus is grieved. Because what we see is we see the condition of people. The Pharisees who think they know God, who think they understand God, are saying, look, you just give us another sign and we'll believe, but the hardness of their heart prevents it. Therefore, if he gave them another sign, and he will, there will be more miracles being done, and then there will be, of course, the sign mentioned in the other Gospels as well. It said, I'll give you the sign of Jonah, which refers to Christ's death and then his resurrection. But you see, sin prevents them, their hard heart prevents them from seeing what is right before their eyes. And we see this when we share the gospel. In times where we'll share the gospel and someone can hear the message of the gospel and yet reject it, and yet turn away from it. The Pharisees want a sign. Jesus said, I'm not going to give this generation a sign. I'm not going to give you something else because I already have. He already is, but he's not. They're saying, well, you give us the right one. You give us a specific one from heaven and we'll say we'll believe you. But the fact is, the hardened hearts, they wouldn't accept that either. Then Jesus tries to teach his disciples as they get back in the boat after having this conversation with the Pharisees. He says to them in verse 14, as they're in the boat, now the disciples had forgotten to bring bread, and they only had one loaf with them in the boat. And Jesus, because they were talking about bread at the time, cautioned them, saying, watch out, beware the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. And what Jesus is saying, he's taking this teachable moment. They were talking about bread, and he says, beware the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. Now, if you recall, earlier in Mark, we talked about those two groups, the Herodians and the Pharisees. One is trying to please God through strict adherence, and the other has no interest in pleasing God and is seeking to fit into the world and the cultures around them. He said, beware this leaven. And by leaven, he's talking about the yeast that you put in bread, and it, of course, expands and grows, and then you can take that and put in another loaf, and it expands and grows, and how it can do many loaves when you have that bit of yeast put in the bread. And he's comparing that to their teaching. Said, beware that. If it gets in, that it will expand and grow, and soon people will be caught into this thinking or this thinking. So Jesus is using this as a teachable moment. But the disciples, they miss it. They miss altogether what Jesus is saying. So here they are in the boat, holding this loaf. And their concern is the fact that there's a whole group of them, of course, in the boat, and they only have one loaf. They should have brought more. So even though Jesus has performed a miracle just recently where he fed 4,000 plus people, And he's trying to teach them now about the Pharisees and where the Pharisees are at, because they would have just heard the conversation Jesus had just had with the Pharisees. They're missing it. And Jesus, aware of this, said to them, "Why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Having eyes you do not see, and having ears you do not hear, and do you not remember?" So Jesus makes a statement to them. He says, you have eyes, but you can't see. You have ears, but you can't hear. You have minds, you have memories, but you can't remember. You can't remember what has been happening. You've seen my power, you've seen my authority, you've seen the bigger picture, and yet right now the only thing that's concerning you is you don't have enough bread on the trip you're on. And he says, is your heart hard? This is that question. Is your heart hard? And for them, the answer is yes. They do not yet have the ability to see, to hear, to understand who Jesus is. When I broke the 5 loaves for 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up? They said to him, 12. And the 7 for 4,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up? And they said, 7. And he said to them, do you not yet understand? Jesus is saying to them, if you knew who I was, if you knew what you were a part of being here with me, if you could actually see and understand and remember, you would have none of these things to worry about. You would not worry about how much bread you brought. You would not worry about whether the ship was going to get through the storm. You wouldn't worry about these things because you would know who I am. You would know who I am. This is important because it's going to lead into a conversation which is about to come up. The next thing we encounter here, we have Jesus, as Jesus heals someone. And it's an interesting narrative because Jesus goes to heal this man at Bethsaida who's blind. And at first, as Jesus speaks to him, touches his face, the man looks up and he says, I can see, but I can't see clearly. He says, I can see people, but they look like trees walking. And then Jesus lays his hand on his eyes again, and he opened his eyes, and his sight was restored, and he could see everything clearly. So we have this picture of Jesus healing, and at first it seems like there's some resistance there, that the man is not healed immediately. It's interesting because it's the one time that we see this in the accounts of Jesus' work, where Jesus heals someone and it's not instantaneous. And there's a lot that has been written about this falling in the midst of the narrative about the hardness of the heart and not perceiving, not seeing clearly. The disciples couldn't see clearly. And then we have this account of this man who at first he can see but not clearly. And then Jesus gives him the ability to see everything. So the question becomes, can you see? Can you see clearly? And I find often this is a question we need to ask ourselves, even for believers, as we look into the Word of God, as we look at what Christ is doing in our lives and the lives of others. There are times where we see, oh, well, I know this is what God has promised. Well, I know this is what God desires to do in me. But do we actually see it at work? Are we able, through the Holy Spirit's prompting, to look at our lives honestly? And do we actually see? So sometimes we can say, oh, I see my life. Things are going pretty well. We don't actually see our lives clearly. But when we see our lives clearly, we see, Lord, I need you to do a work here. My relationships aren't well. My testimony isn't well. Lord, I need you to do a work here. I need to see clearly. Now we take this and we go into the last part of this chapter, and we're going to come to a very interesting conversation. Some people have called this Peter's greatest answer and his greatest failure. Because Jesus poses the question. This is the question that has been running along throughout the gospel thus far. Now Jesus is going to verbalize this question. He says in verse 27, "And Jesus went out with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. And on the way he asked his disciples, 'Who do people say that I am?' And they told him, 'John the Baptist. Others say Elijah, and others one of the prophets.' And he asked them, 'But who do you say that I am?'" Who do you say that I am? This is the gospel question. Who do you say that I am? This is the question that every single person must come to terms with in their understanding of the gospel. This is the question that Mark wants people to wrestle with as they hear or read this gospel. Who do you say? And they begin by talking about what other people say. And he said, some people think that you're John the Baptist, come back to life. Some people think you're the prophet Elijah who has come back to earth. And some think that you're someone else. And then Jesus turns to this group of men that have been traveling with him, to his chosen group, and he poses the question to them, who do you say that I am? And Jesus is expecting an answer. And the answer we get comes from Peter, one of the 12. And Peter makes this statement. He says, "You are the Christ." He's saying, you are the anointed one. You are the Messiah. You are the one that we as a people have been looking for. This is a powerful statement. You are the Christ. So, in his interactions and his following Jesus, Peter has come to the point where he believes that Jesus is the one that the people are looking for. He believes that Jesus is the anointed one. He is the Messiah. Now, we can read this from the other side of the cross and go, what an awesome testimony. But we need to understand that Peter is speaking here with still a mind that is darkened. Peter is speaking here still with a heart that is hardened, because his understanding only goes so far. And it's important because now Jesus is going to take this and help expand their understanding. Who do you say that I am? You are the Christ. Verse 31, and he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things, and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he said this plainly. So now what Jesus is going to do is Jesus, for the first time, is going to explain what he has come to do. So he says that he will be rejected. He will be killed. And he will rise again. This is the reason Jesus came. Jesus came so that he would be rejected. Jesus came so that he would be killed. Jesus came so that he would rise again from the grave 3 days later. And in doing that, he would fulfill Scripture. In doing that, he would provide the way for salvation. This is what the anointed one, this is what the chosen one, this is what the Messiah will do to bring deliverance. This is why he's come. For the people hearing this gospel, this is Mark saying, all that you've heard of Jesus, all the bits, all the pieces, all the events, this is why. It didn't happen because he was a good man and then they turned on him. This was his purpose. He knew his purpose before it happened. But then Peter responds. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. So when Peter hears, this is what Jesus says, this is what I've come to do. I've come to be rejected, I've come to be killed, and I've come to rise again on the third day from the grave. This is what he's come to do. Peter's response is, that's wrong. Jesus, I don't know what you're saying, but that's wrong. If you talk like that, then it's never going to see. You are this, so that can't happen to you. You can't be rejected because you are this. You can't be killed because you are this. You're going to bring deliverance to the nation. You can't rise again on the third day. That's not even possible. So Peter takes him aside and says, look, you can't talk that way. That's not right. And Jesus' response to him is hard to hear. Because Jesus calls him Satan. Satan, which the word means adversary. So Jesus says to him, Peter, right now, you need to get out of my way. Because right now, that thinking, that view of what this means, your darkened mindset of what the Christ is and what you think it's going to become, is going to interfere with why I have come. So get out of my way. Sometimes we, in the history of the world, we as people have thought that we were on the right page. We have thought that what we were doing was going to further the kingdom. And there are times where we look at history and realize that Christ was saying to us, right now, you're being my adversary. You're hindering the purposes of the gospel. Get out of my way. Get out of my way. Sometimes that happens even as we seek to live out our testimony and we think, okay, this is what being a Christian means. So I'm going to present this way. I'm going to act this way. I'm going to tell other people, well, if you act this way too, then that'll be good. And Jesus is saying, look, if you preach any other gospel other than the gospel of Jesus Christ, other than people coming to me in their brokenness, because only I can restore, only I can renew, only I can make them a new creation. If you tell them anything else, and this becomes the challenge to those who tried to bring Judaism into the gospel, said, you are becoming my adversary. And get out of my way. This becomes that challenge to us that we would not ever find ourselves as an adversary to the gospel. That in no matter what our intent, that we would not become an adversary to the gospel. For you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man. And then calling the crowd to him with his disciples, he said to them, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? For what can a man give in return for his soul? For whoever is ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him will the Son of Man also be ashamed when he comes in glory of his Father and with the holy angels. This last part becomes a powerful, powerful statement. Jesus is explaining to all his disciples who are following him what it will mean to follow Christ. He said, you need to understand that all your preconceived notions they need to go. That I'm not going to build a political empire. You're not going to be socially on top. You're not even going to be liked. So you need to gain that understanding. If you're going to be with me, you need to understand that it's going to eclipse everything else. That if you try to look after yourself and be with me, that's not going to work. That if you try to look after your own interests and be with me, that's not going to work. If you try to protect yourself with me, that's not going to work. You need to be eclipsed by me. I'm not going to make a political empire, so if that's what you're looking for, that's not going to happen. I'm not going to give you great social status, so if that's what you're looking for, that's not going to happen. I'm not going to even put you in a position where you will be liked. That's not going to happen. And if any of this is more appealing to you, and you put it before me, know that then you're not have no part with me. If you would put any of this before me, then you have no part with me. Because see, Peter could make the bold assertion that Jesus was the Christ, but the problem was Peter's concept of what Jesus was as the Christ was flawed. There was a problem there. Because he didn't understand why Jesus was coming to bring deliverance from sin. That was not his understanding, and that had to give way to the truth. Otherwise, he became an adversary. And that's what Jesus is saying in his last part, that if you are ashamed of Christ, if you are not willing to stand with him and believe him on his terms and believe he did what he said he did, if you try to change it into something else because for some reason you don't accept what he did, then you are in fact ashamed of him. And you're actually an adversary to the gospel. This is a heavy thing to end on, but it becomes our challenge. It becomes our challenge for us. What is our image of Jesus? Think back to the previous chapters, those people who encountered Jesus and they were so zealous because he is the one who does all things well. That we accept Jesus on his terms because Jesus told us, this is why I've come into the world. That I am going to be rejected, that I am going to be killed, and that I'm going to rise again on the third day. Accept me for who I am, for why I've come. Cast aside everything else. This doesn't matter. Cast aside your own goals and your own things that you're holding on to. Simply trust and embrace me. I who do all things well. Pray that you have eyes to see and ears to hear and minds to remember. Because see, this is this message of this gospel. Don't be one of those with a hard heart. Don't be one of those still clinging to preconceived notions. but know who Jesus is in his truth and his fullness. I pray that this has been an encouragement to you and a challenge this week. As always, leave any comments that you have, and if this has encouraged you, please share it with somebody else. Thank you, and God bless.